Before we go any further with Express, and before we really start developing some code, we're going to focus right now on middleware. Now, I've used the term middleware, and we've kind of seen a little bit of how middleware works, and we've seen a couple of different types of middleware, and I've pointed that middleware out to you. And in this screencast, what we're going to do is we're going to dive a little bit deeper into middleware so we can see exactly what it is and exactly how it works so that we have a really good understanding of middleware. And that is because as we begin to develop more complex applications, we are actually going to, as web developers, take advantage of the middleware in order to add custom code to handle different things within our requests and our responses after and before they've been handled by common middleware, such as routers. Now, if we remember back to when we talked about routers, we saw that we imported our routers right here using the require, and we imported those from our routes folder. And the one that we looked at a lot was our index.js, where we had a router handling the root path of our website, which of course is just if we were to look at the actual URL that would be passed in, it would have been http://www.mycoolapp.com/. And of course it could either have the slash or no slash. Either way, our HTTP web server would route to this router function right here for this get using the single slash, which is represented by this right here. Now, this router right here, of course, is an object provided to us by the Express router functionality that Express has in it. And the get function, this ends up being the actual middleware function that is handling this particular route. And then we have our callback function right here, which handles the asynchronous callback that comes from this particular route handler. And then we've got this function right here, and this function is our callback function, and it acts as the function that is being called by the middleware. And one thing you'll notice about middleware is that middleware can take in a request, a response, and a next in it. So let's go back to our app.js, where we have kind of a generic example of middleware. Now here's where our router middleware is put in. And the way you can identify that something has been set up as a middleware is when you see app.use. App.use in the Express app.js, wherever you see the actual Express app being instantiated right here. Anytime you see app.use, what you're seeing right here is we are injecting a piece of middleware into the execution path for an HTTP request that came in. And I'm going to diagram out what I mean by that so that it's better understood visually as to what I mean by injecting that middleware into the execution path of an HTTP request. And here you can see we actually inject our custom route handlers. We've got our index one, which came when we used the Express generator, but then we added our own users one and then a products one. And we can see that these route handlers are actually injected into the app's execution using this app.use. Now, all of the middleware that gets put into our application is executed in order through the chain of that HTTP request as it gets processed by Express. And so the order in which you add your use statements with your middleware, that's the order of execution that will happen. If you notice, inside of all of these app.use, we have our logger, we have the Express.json parser, the Express URL encoder, a cookie parser, and then of course our static path for responding to static asset requests like pictures, images, videos, CSS files, JavaScript files, stuff like that. After all of that, we then have our routers right here. And it's only after we've tried to handle every single route that we then have a generic 404 page not found catch where we're going to handle any route that has not been already handled by one of the routers. And there's a very specific reason why they are in this order, because it's executing from top to bottom. And when the execution of, or when the processing of that HTTP request comes into Express, we of course want to log information about it, especially when we're in development mode. We of course want the Express to parse the body as though it's JSON, or to be able to handle the JSON body. Of course, we want to encode and decode the URL when it comes in, just in case we've got URL encoded parameters inside of our URL. We want to parse all of the cookies that come back from the browser so that we've got those inside of our routes when we need to parse out cookie information. And then, before we ever try to handle any of our custom routes with our dynamic handlers right here, we want to go ahead and serve up any static resources that we have and then not waste time trying to match routes down here if it ends up being a static file, which means if the route starts with /public, we don't want to go down here to any of these. We want to go ahead and go to our public folder, which is right over here, and serve up the image or the JavaScript or the style sheets, these static assets. And then we want the request to end instead of spending any time coming down here and handling the rest of this. So let's go ahead and let's kind of see how this would work. We'll take what's in here and then we'll kind of diagram the time of execution of that HTTP request as it comes into Express. And we'll see that each of these handlers actually handles something as it comes in through the Express as we process that HTTP request. So we'll start right here, and we're going to add ourselves a linear time. So we're going to have time starts on the left, and then time progresses to the right. And so we have ourselves an HTTP request, which is what we're dealing with. And that request, we're going to have the request vary as we go through this. But if we go back to here and we look at this, let's pick some of our middleware. We've got a logger right here. We've got our JSON body parser right here, URL encoder, a cookie parser. And then we have our routes. And then we have this custom handler for if the request can't be handled by any of the previous middleware. Then we'll go ahead and call this function right here. And we'll send back an error, and that error of a 404 error gets generated by this awesome library right here called HTTP errors. So let's map out some of them in the process they go. We're not going to map out all of them because that would just take too much time and be tedious. So let's do the logger, the cookie parser, the static, and then our index router. And let's start with those. So logger, cookie parser, our static files, and then our index router. So let's head back to our file here. All right. So again, request starts on the left, time moves to the right, and we're going to go ahead and identify each of the middleware that we have as that get executed as that HTTP request gets processed by Express. So right here, we decided we were going to handle the logger. So the logger middleware would sit right here at the very beginning of that HTTP request coming in. And then we decided that we were going to look at the cookie parser. So then the cookie parser would be the next one that would get called. And then we had that public middleware that handled any request that comes in for a static asset. So let's go ahead and put in there static assets, and that of course maps to our public folder, which has our JavaScript images and style sheets in it. And then the other one we wanted to put on here was our index router. So we've got our router that is handling our index case, which is of course is just a slash. And then we had our error handler, so that was the 404 error, and so that is of course a page not found. That's when any of these other middleware don't handle that particular route, and that of course is mostly handled with the static handler and then one of our routers. And in this case, since we're only worrying about the index router, anything that isn't caught by the middleware for public or by our index router would of course return a 404 error in this particular case right here. So then let's go ahead and let's talk about the process as different URLs come in to Express. So let's identify that this is the Express process right here. So this is Express handling everything. And then we're going to go ahead and, just to be very specific, we're going to go ahead and identify that this right here is our start of the process. And then we have our end of the process right here. So we'll see that with a green and a red. And so that's the start of our HTTP request and the end of the HTTP request. All right, so in green, let's do blue. We're going to put a blue right here, and we are going to say that this first request that comes in, of course, it's going to be a full URL, http://www.mycoolapp.com. And so that's the root URL. That's what's handled by Express itself. So all the requests coming in under this domain are going to be handled by Express. And now we're going to talk about specifically the paths that come in for this HTTP request. And we're going to put those paths right here and kind of change and modify them as we look at different requests that come in. So we'll do a slash, and then let's do like a static asset. So we'll do public, and then we'll do style.css. So that, of course, is going to be our CSS style. So let's put that one right there. And let's see what happens when this request comes into Express from our HTTP server. And let's see how the middleware handles that. So in this particular situation right here, what we're going to see happen is we are actually going to see, number one, because the logger really doesn't have anything to do with the route or the path, it's simply going to log some information every time an HTTP request comes through Express. And since it is there in our middleware stack right here, and it's pretty much the first middleware, if we see it's the first app.use, because it is the first middleware, it's going to be the first one to execute and try to handle something within this request that just came in. Now, because it doesn't really care about paths, because that's really what the static and the routers do, and because they are specifically designed and written to handle the path of an HTTP request, we're going to go ahead and see how this happens. So the logger right here, it's going to go ahead, and as this request comes in, it's going to go ahead and probably to a file or to a database or something, it's going to log some information about the request that came in. And so it could be something like we're logging headers to see what's coming in. We might be logging a auth token just to make sure things are working. And of course, if you looked at our code, these are just happening in dev. We probably wouldn't log all of this stuff in a production environment. Maybe we are logging the time the request took, so the response time. Maybe we're logging the body as well, just so that we can see what came in that request. And so this is probably logged to a file or to a database or to some kind of a logging service. And so this happens no matter what. The logger will execute, and it will log whatever that logger is set up to log. And it'll do it on every single request, no matter what the path is. The next thing that is going to be executed is the cookie parser. Now the cookie parser, because it also doesn't care about the path, it cares about the whole HTTP request, it's going to go through and it is going to pull out of the request all the data that makes up cookies, and it's going to parse those cookies and then turn them into, let's go ahead and move to text. We want to use our text right here. It's going to go ahead and it's going to turn all the cookies into JSON objects. So we're going to have, or JavaScript objects, right? JSON, JavaScript objects, same thing. So it's going to turn these into JavaScript objects that represent each and every cookie that got passed back by or got sent to us from the client or the browser or the application, the mobile web app, whatever it is that made the call to our API or to our Express application. So it's going to parse all those cookies, and it's going to add those cookies to our request object so that we have access to it in further middleware. So all of these cookies are going to get attached to that request object that came in, and we're going to have access to the data that's held inside of those cookies. Now, in this particular situation here, when we have a /public/styles.css route, because we are dealing with a route and our next two middleware actually handle specifically the path or the route, right? It's called a path on an HTTP request, but we call it a route inside of an application. Now, that's just what they decided to do when they implemented web applications. And so we've got these two different words that mean pretty much the same thing. But we can see that because this request actually begins with public and our static handler handles any path with public at the root of it, we know that this particular static middleware is going to respond to this route right here. So what is going to happen in this situation is that our router is going to, this particular static middleware is going to identify that it is a public route. That means it's responsible for it. Then it's going to look at what comes after this primary part of the path. It's going to see that it's the styles.css, and therefore, if we go back to our application, this particular static middleware that's provided to us by Express, it is going to then look inside of our public folder in our website. It's going to go to styles, and it's going to find that style.css. Now, because we have this folder styles right here, we're going to have to update this path that we have right here because I forgot to add styles right here. So let's go ahead and update that so that we're being more accurate in what we're doing here. So I'm going to erase that. Then we're going to come back here and we're going to do this path correctly. So it's going to be /public and then /style sheets, I believe is what it was called. And then it's going to be, let's go look at it. Style sheets and then style.css is how it should have been. That path should have looked. So let's go ahead and finish that off with a style.css. All right. So with this particular path, let's jump back into it. Because the static router handles the public path at its root, and then because it handles anything that's after public in the path, it's going to go to the style sheet folder, and then from the style sheet folder, it's going to go find the file styles. And then, because it's responsible for this, it's going to go ahead and it is going to end the request right here, and it is going to send that style.css file back to the client. And so we will end up with the actual request, instead of it continuing on to our router and then to the 404, our request actually will terminate with the static public middleware sending back this static asset to the user. And it's going to end right there. And the routers will never be called and the 404 will never be called because we had a middleware inside the execution of our request handler inside of Express. It decided that it is 100% in charge of this and that it would make sure it handles sending this style sheet back to the user, and it will end the request. And then the rest of the middleware doesn't get executed. And so we don't have to worry about all of this being called and trying to handle the route because it was handled by this particular middleware. So let's see what happens if we have another route or another path that is separate from this path. And let's look at just our index path. So if we have, and of course this is our root, so if we have the path just /, which is the root path of our application, and so we've got http www.mycoolapp.com, and then all we have is a / in the path, we're going to see this same execution process happen. Logger is going to log what it logs. Cookie parser is going to parse all of the cookies and add them to the request object so we have access to them. Now the static middleware, when it sees that there is no /public in this path, it doesn't have this prerequisite in the path right here, it is simply going to ignore the request and it's going to call next. And instead of it handling returning an asset for the request, because it's just going to call next, it is going to then pass the handling of this particular request over to the router. So let's use a different color to show how that might work. So we're going to use red right here. So for this root path that we've got in our URL, it's going to go to the logger, to the cookie parser. So let's do that. So logger is going to execute. It'll do its thing. The cookie parser is then going to handle it after the logger, because the logger doesn't end the request and pass it back to the user. It just handles logging stuff, and then it passes the request to the cookie parser middleware. Cookie parser, it doesn't handle sending anything back to the user. So it's just going to do what it's responsible for. Then it's going to pass the request to the next middleware. And that's kind of why we call it middleware. It's software that's in the middle of all of this execution, and it's responsible for something. And if it determines that it is responsible for this particular request, then it is going to do what it's supposed to, and then either log something or provide some kind of functionality, or it is going to handle the request and send something back like this static middleware does. Well, in this situation, this static middleware sees that this particular path that we've got right here does not meet the requirements of /public. So the root requirement is not there. So instead of static going through and handling the request, it is simply going to pass the request to the first router in the series of routers that we had in our application. Now we're ignoring the other routers right now, but the first router is this index router that we have. Now the index router, it knows that its root path, or the thing that it is responsible for, is indeed the root path, which is simply the /. Now because it's in charge of that, it is going to actually handle the request. So what it is going to do is it is of course going to say, okay, so we have a /. I am in charge of this request. And when we go back to our router, our index router, and we look at how its handler is set up, so this function is actually going to get called. And here's where that happened. The router, we know it's a HTTP GET, and it is using the root of the website, which of course we saw right there. This is the function that gets called as the handler, or as the middleware function, to handle this /path. And here we've got a response.render. And as we learned when we were first looking into Express as a monolithic web app, or a normal web application, not a web API, when we call render, render uses the Jade view engine, and it goes and it finds the index view right here, this Jade index view, as well as the layout, and it injects this index view into the layout, builds the HTML, and then sends the response back to the user. And this is where this is happening right here. And you can see that instead of calling next, it's just using the response and then sending that response back. So if we go back to our diagram, and we look at it here, what's going to happen right here is the router, because it's responding to the /, it's then of course going to call the Jade engine that's inside of Express, because we're going to be compiling HTML. So it's going to call Jade, and Jade is then of course going to go pull the index partial. That's that index Jade file. So it's going to pull that partial, then it's going to pull the layout, which is also a partial, and of course it represents portions of our HTML, right? It's going to go ahead, and so from this, the router is going to pass it to Jade. Jade's going to go pull that index partial. It's going to take that index partial, and it is going to plug in the data that we pass it. Remember, these were the variables with data that we were passing into the view engine to be compiled into our HTML. And we see that in Jade right here, where we are pushing that data into the HTML. And once it injects that data into the HTML in the partial, then it's going to go ahead and inject that partial into the full layout, which gives us our full HTML. And at the end of that, we have a dynamically generated, I think I spelled everything right, dynamically generated HTML page. is what we end up with. And so with that dynamic HTML page being created, then our router will go ahead and finish that request and send it off to the client. So maybe we need to be specific that this is the request returning to our client. Okay, so that's the request returning to the client. And then that's the same thing up here that we talked about when a public or when a static file is returned by the static middleware. So then we have our request returning to our client. It's the same thing right there. Okay, so now if we have another one, if we get a path that also does not exist and can't be handled by our static middleware and can't be handled by one of our router middleware, then we end up with this 404 middleware handling it. Now, hopefully you get it by now. I'm going to go ahead and go through the 404 because repetition helps set everything in our minds. So I'm going to go ahead and go through this 404. If you get this process and you totally understand it, go ahead and skip this, but let's go through the 404 just for repetition's sake. So let's say that we have now a particular path in our request URL, so this HTTP request. We're going to go ahead and say that the next one that we are trying to handle is going to be an error path. So some path that we're not handling, not a real path. So somebody asks for www.mycoolapp.com/not-a-real-path. And so let's use a different color as we move down through here. Let's just use blue. So again, it's going to come through. Oops, I need to have my arrow selected. All right, we've got our line tool. All right, so that request is going to come through. Logger is going to do what it does. Then Logger is going to pass it to Cookie Parser. Cookie Parser is going to do what it does. It's going to pass it to the static. Static sees that the path does not include public in it, so it doesn't care about this request, so it's going to pass it on to the next middleware. Our router is going to look at the path and see that it is not the single slash, so it's not the root of our application, therefore it doesn't care about this request either. So it's going to pass it along to the next middleware. Now, in our code right here, we have several middleware that happen before the 404, but we can see that this middleware only cares about /users, and this one only cares about /products. That means that this particular request that we're working with now, /not-a-real-path, isn't going to be caught by either of those middleware. Therefore, it'll bypass both of those. They'll continue to pass the request on until it gets to the next middleware. Now, our next middleware is this 404 handler. And our 404 handler is going to see that this is a path that has not been handled by any other middleware before it. And because it handles all paths that have not been handled by other middleware, it's going to go ahead and it is going to execute the code right here, and it is going to call next and throw an error. So it's going to use this cool library HTTP errors to then create a 404 page not found error, and it's going to pass that back to the client. So if we come back here to our flow, because it's not a real path, it's going to go ahead and it is going to use that middleware that we saw before, and that middleware is going to go ahead and generate a 404 response. Okay. It's going to generate that 404 response, and then with that response, then of course we get that response sent back to the user. Now, one thing here, I did use the term request right here, just because we're talking about the fact that this is an HTTP request coming in. But the reality is that a response is being generated. So it is really a response going back to the client, not the request. So let's just make that correction right there. This isn't a request going back. It is actually an HTTP response that is being generated in response to this HTTP request that we've been dealing with as we go through these paths. So again, this should be HTTP response that's returning to the client as a result to this request. And then same thing down here. It's actually an HTTP response that's going back to the client as a result of this request path that we went through. All right. So hopefully this helps you understand how middleware actually works, in that it handles specific situations or cases dealing with an HTTP request. And if it's responsible for that request based on some set of rules, it will then take over the request, do what it's supposed to, and either provide some functionality or do something, or it will actually handle the request itself and then generate a response to send back to the client, and then the request response cycle is done. Again, remember, the middleware has rules or cases that determine whether or not it is to do anything with the request, and then of course, whether or not it is supposed to generate a response to send back to the client. If it does not feel that it is in charge of the request or has any functionality to provide to the request, it is going to bypass messing with the request and pass it to the next middleware. And then that middleware will go through the same process of determining if it is responsible for the request and whether it should just do something and then pass it to the next middleware, or if it should handle the request itself, build a response, and send it back to the user.